The snow is thick on the shoulder of Route 117, and the trees lean in close like they're listening. A car slows. A woman, half frozen, coat shredded, hair matted with blood, flags the driver down with one trembling hand. She can barely speak. Her words come out as pieces. Woods, commune, Roch, she whispers. He says he speaks for God. The driver pulls her in, closes the door, and for a long moment, nobody says anything. This is stillness and urgency braided together. This is fear you can see. This is Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Welcome. Today, we're going to walk through a story that is small in geography, but enormous in its moral and psychological reach. The Anthill Kids. It's a Canadian cult led by Roch Thériault, who, over years, became less a pastor than a tyrant. This episode will trace how he built power, how people were drawn in, how coercive control turned everyday lives into instruments of obedience, and what finally cracked the commune wide open. We will speak plainly about abuse and brutality. We will not linger in the sensational. We are doing this to understand how ordinary people can be pulled into extraordinary harm, and to ask the questions that remain, questions that in many ways are still unanswered. I am not alone in this episode. I'm joined by Dr. Laurent Bouchard, a clinical psychologist who has spent 2 decades working with survivors and studying high-control religious groups in Quebec and Ontario. Laurent, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mara. It's a heavy story, but an important one.
Heavy, yes. Before we go farther, one quick note about language. We will use the word cult in the episode because that's how many survivors and reports describe Anthill Kids, but we'll also be specific about behaviors, coercive control, trauma bonding, spiritual abuse. We'll treat the people who lived there first as human beings, not merely victims or numbers, okay?
Absolutely. That framing matters. It changes how we listen.
Let's begin at the beginning. To understand Anthill Kids, we start with the man at its center, Roch Thériault. Laurent, can I ask you to stay with me through this portrait? I want listeners to get the texture of who he was without turning him into a caricature.
Yes, please.
Roch was born in a small Quebec town. Imagine a kitchen that smells like coffee and damp wool. He grows up around Catholic rituals, the kind of tight religiosity that both comforts and polices. People in town remember him as sharp. He was funny, quick, and a little volatile. He devoured both scripture and what he called healing lore. There's a scene I keep thinking about. A younger Roch in someone's kitchen, arguing theology like it's a game, and by the end of the cup of coffee, he has the hostess nodding along as if she'd been convinced of a prophecy.
That ability to command attention. It's not always loud. Often, it's a combination of charisma and timing. He would know what someone feared and what they hoped for, and he would deliver a story that filled those gaps.
Right. And early on, there were warning signs people could later see. Jealousy in his relationships, a need for constant admiration, an impatience that turned to rage when he felt challenged. He also developed an interest in medicine and healing, not formal med school medicine, but a bricolage of folk remedies, counsel, and a confidence that he could fix people's bodies and souls.
This mixed religious language plus pseudo-medical authority can be particularly dangerous. It gives a leader the ability to define reality for other people. If you say, "I can heal you," you step into a role that makes people vulnerable to suggestion and dependency.
And then, by the late 1970s and into the 1980s, there's a cultural moment that matters. Back to the land movements, distrust of institutions, and interest in alternative therapies. People were searching for community and purity. Roch assembled a message that fit into that moment. He didn't start with violence. He started as a healer and a prophet who promised refuge.
Exactly. People who feel dislocated or betrayed by mainstream institutions, divorced from family, recovering from addiction, looking for meaning, are more likely to take the risk of following a charismatic leader. It feels like safety in a chaotic world.
That's where the recruitment begins. It's quiet at first, a seminar here, a late-night conversation on a church basement bench. The outreach looks like earnest alternatives, better health, honest work, a closer walk with God. A young woman who's recently left an abusive marriage hears him speak about purity and protection. She's tired. He reaches out, listens, gives practical advice about herbs or a massage, small acts that create intimacy. Then the offers escalate. Come to the commune. We'll build a family. That's the language. Family.
And family is a loaded word. It promises belonging, daily intimacy, a place where your small needs are noticed. At the outset, it disguises the power dynamics that will come. Come be with us feels like rescue. It's love bombing, overwhelming attention, competing against a person's prior networks. When you cut off the old supports one by one, the new group becomes the only reference point for truth.
They moved into the woods. People called it anthill because the residents were always building, digging, moving earth like ants. The camp was isolated. Crude wooden shacks, a central building where Roch preached, children playing in the brush. In the early months, there was real camaraderie. People worked hard, there were shared meals, laughter. For an outsider, it could look like a tight-knit commune with a focus on work and health.
Many abusive groups begin that way. Practical cooperation, shared labor. It creates a baseline of trust. The danger appears gradually. Small rules, then more. Leaders introduce discipline, first for waste, then for rebellion, then for the most intimate parts of life.
At first, the rules were manageable. Modest dress, a structured daily schedule, confession meetings. Then the rules hardened. Diet restrictions, limits on who could speak to whom, rules about sleep and privacy. Confessions moved from voluntary to required, and what began as share your struggles mutated into public shaming. Children were disciplined in new, strict ways. Sexual access to women shifted under the rhetoric of spiritual marriage. Small things people told themselves were for survival or cleanliness became mechanisms of control.
And that's where the psychological gears click into place. When a leader positions himself as the only mediator between the group and God, he can define moral reality. "I know God's will" is the phrase that creates moral monopoly. Once you accept that one voice speaks for the divine, dissent is not just disagreement, it's sacrilege.
It's so hard listening to survivors' accounts because the shift was incremental and deeply human. People rationalized. They prayed harder. They offered themselves because they believed they were doing God's work. Even gratitude for the early shelter made it disorienting to call it abuse. By the time the cruelty was visible, by the time people were being beaten, starved, mutilated, the community was already isolated. They were cut off, physically, financially, and emotionally.
Isolation is the structural backbone of coercive control. Without outside checks, friends, social services, a trusted doctor, the leader's narrative becomes the only one that exists. Their world shrinks to what the leader allows. It's very effective.
Let's talk about escalation. At some point, Roch stopped merely punishing and began to instill terror as a method. Confessions were used to humiliate, punish and mark people for continued control. Work longer, pray more, confess deeper. These were never just about discipline. They were the infrastructure for something crueler.
Ritualized punishment serves multiple functions. It instills fear, it creates demonstrated consequences for disobedience, and it reinforces the leader's claim to absolute moral authority. Survivors describe a cycle: affection and praise, a transgression or perceived transgression, severe punishment, then forgiveness from the leader. That cycle creates trauma bonds, strong paradoxical attachments to an abuser because the abuser is also the source of relief.
I want to be careful here. We will never describe the most graphic details of the physical abuse. We'll say what was done in a measured way, because the point is not to shock, but to explain the mechanism. The violations included extreme physical beatings, medically abusive practices disguised as healing, sexual coercion, and the deliberate degradation of members' autonomy. Children were used to cement control. Pregnancies were monitored. Relationships were arranged. State medical care was sometimes cut off. There were spells of starving and forced labor meant to break people's will.
And there's a pattern clinicians see across many high-control groups. The leader weaponizes basic human needs: food, sleep, bodily autonomy. When you control those, you control someone's mental life. You reduce their capacity to think clearly. That impairment makes escape and planning much harder.
So people ask, why did they stay? Let's stop the chronology for a moment and answer that clearly. Laurent, walk us through the psychology of why someone would stay in a place like the anthill commune, even when their life is endangered.
Okay, there are 4 main components to emphasize. First, love bombing and social investment at the outset. Second, isolation that removes alternative perspectives. Third, a cycle of abuse and intermittent reward that forms traumatic attachment. Fourth, spiritual coercion, belief that God or salvation requires obedience. Past these, there are practical barriers: no money, no transportation, threats to family members. From the inside, leaving feels like stepping off a cliff, not just physically, but morally and spiritually. You're not only losing shelter, you're losing the world in which your identity is anchored.
Listeners, imagine being told that the safety of your children, your salvation, or your very soul depended on your obedience. Imagine being cut off from your parents, told they don't understand, that they're the ones deceived. That kind of narrative makes leaving not just difficult, it feels wrong. It feels like betrayal.
Yeah, that betrayal framing is powerful. A survivor will often say, "I felt guilty for wanting out because I thought it would doom the others." Guilt is leverage to keep people compliant. Add physical fear punishments, the threat of harm, and the calculus for escape becomes paralyzing rather than rational.
Which brings us to the point where the story broke open. A woman managed to escape. We began the episode with that scene of her on the side of the road. Let me tell that escape again, now with context. She had been recognized by Robanch as someone valuable, maybe because she could bear children, maybe because she had close ties within the group. Over time, her injuries accumulated. She was not rescued by luck. She made a decision. The decision came after a string of choices where violence escalated in a way she could no longer rationalize as spiritual correction. At some hour, bandaged and bleeding, she ran to the road.
And that decision is profoundly courageous. Escapes require a mental calculus, weighing safety, the potential of being pursued, the possibility that no one will believe you. Many survivors report that the moment they decided to leave, they were terrified not only of being caught, but of being disbelieved.
She flagged down a car. She whispered, "Ant Hill," and Roch. The driver thought she had been in an accident. Then he realized her wounds were deliberate. He took her to the hospital. The medical staff, the police. This is where the outside world finally intersected with the commune's closed reality. For the first time, someone outside the system could see the pattern, document it, and respond.
And yet, even with that intervention, the aftermath is complicated. Rescue does not automatically undo the damage. It opens an investigation, possibly arrests, but survivors carry trauma, shame, and legal complexities for years.
When authorities entered Ant Hill, they found a scene of deprivation, ritualized control, and people who were both visibly broken and alarmingly normalized to their circumstances. The state charged Roch Thériault with various crimes. There were trials, the media came, of course, and some legal accountability was achieved. Roch spent years in prison and later died there. But, and this is important, legal action did not return lost childhoods or the time stolen from mothers and fathers. It could not fully account for the structural failures that allowed this to continue.
Right. The criminal justice system is oriented around individual responsibility and punishment. It can hold a man accountable in court, but it struggles to repair systemic neglect, the social isolation, the cultural blind spots that allowed a community to form and operate with so little outside scrutiny.
Laurent, tell listeners, were there clear missed opportunities from neighbors, health professionals, or the state? Could anything have been done earlier?
There are often moments where intervention might have been possible. Family members reporting concerns, healthcare professionals noticing injuries inconsistent with accidents, social workers asking more probing questions. Any of these could have put pressure on the commune. But we must be careful. It's easy in hindsight to draw a neat line. The reality is that people in the outside world often assumed this was a private, consensual community. They had limited legal grounds to push a door open. And when reports were made, they were sometimes downplayed as domestic issues or private religious practices. Cultural deference to religious autonomy complicates early intervention.
There's also the problem of stigma. Some survivors told me they were ashamed to tell outsiders, believing they'd be judged for joining what the outside saw as an extremist group. That shame is a barrier to early detection.
Absolutely. Shame silences. And institutions, healthcare, police, child services, often lack the training to recognize coercive control when it's wrapped in religious language. They may treat injuries as isolated incidents rather than part of a pattern.
So, after Roch's arrest, the public narrative was simple. One evil man, a hideous set of crimes, justice served. But survivors' lives are messy, ongoing, and sometimes invisible. Let's slow down and listen to that aftermath. Laurent, what do survivors typically face once they leave?
Several interwoven challenges. First, practical. Housing, identity paperwork, healthcare, and money. Many had no formal documentation. Second, psychological. PTSD, complex trauma, attachment disruptions, difficulty trusting others. Third, social. Stigma from the broader society, sometimes rejection from family who can't understand why they stayed. Fourth, spiritual. Many survivors wrestle with faith, reconciling the language of Scripture used to harm them with whatever spiritual needs they still have. That spiritual struggle can be as destabilizing as the physical.
I heard a caseworker once tell me that survivors sometimes told her, Don't ask me about the God part. I need my heart to stop breaking about it. Which is to say, faith can be a wound as well as a resource. And some people, children raised entirely in the commune, have to relearn basic social cues and civic life.
Relearning is a good word. If your formative years are governed by mistrust of institutions, irregular schooling, and a worldview centered on one leader, the social skills we take for granted may not be there. Therapy helps, but access is unequal. Many survivors struggle for years with limited support.
Listeners, if we sound grim, you're right to feel that way. This story is grim, but it's also threaded with resilience. Survivors build lives. Some find therapy and solidarity. Some rebuild relationships with family. Some become activists, insisting the world pay attention so what happened to them doesn't happen to others. That brings us to a set of questions that hang over this entire case, the still unanswered questions.
Yes, those are the questions that matter beyond the headlines. Why did institutions fail to see the danger? How can we balance religious freedom with protective oversight? Why do certain personalities become destructive leaders? And how do survivors reconstruct moral meaning when the language of God was used as a weapon?
I want to unpack each of those. First, institutions. In the Anthill case, there were reports and suspicious injuries over the years that were either misattributed or not pursued aggressively. Problems were categorized as family conflicts or private beliefs. We have to ask, are there systemic gaps, legal, cultural, educational, that make it easy for isolated, high-control groups to avoid scrutiny?
Yes, there are structural blind spots. Child protection systems often depend on reports from the public, but when a community is insular, there are fewer reports. Police may be reluctant to enter spaces where religious rituals are practiced, fearing accusations of infringing on faiths. And health professionals may lack training to recognize when spiritual language masks abuse. We need better cross-training, clinicians, social workers, police, and faith leaders learning the same red flags and how to respond safely.
Second question. Religious freedom versus oversight. It's a delicate balance. We don't want the state policing dissent or new religious movements out of hand. But where faith claims become instruments of harm, we must have mechanisms to intervene. Laurent, how do we protect religious liberty while also protecting vulnerable people?
Intersectional approaches are key. Create legal thresholds for intervention focused on objective harm, lack of food, medical neglect, reports of violence, rather than subjective assessments of doctrine. At the same time, encourage third-party oversight, outreach programs, independent inspectors for registered communities, and safe reporting channels that respect confidentiality. Partnership with local religious leaders who can offer peer oversight is also effective. When trusted faith figures are willing to speak against abuse, it reduces the narrative that intervention equals persecution.
Third, why did Roch become what he became? Psychologists have theories, but none are definitive. Childhood trauma, personality disorder traits, opportunism, and sociocultural opportunity all combine. Laurent, what can we responsibly say about why some people become dangerous leaders?
We can say that certain traits correlate. Narcissism, a need for control, manipulative interpersonal style, and that environmental opportunities matter. A combination of personal pathology and social opportunity, places where institutions are weakened and people are searching, creates fertile ground. But it's never a single cause. It's a complex wrecking together of factors.
Lastly, survivors and faith. How does someone disentangle spiritual belief from spiritual manipulation? It seems nearly impossible to do it all at once.
It is a long process. For many, rebuilding means separating personal spiritual experience from the authority that abused them. Some find new spiritual paths, others leave faith entirely. Psychotherapeutic approaches that respect a survivor's belief system while examining how it was used to control are often most effective. The key is agency, helping survivors reclaim their interpretive frameworks so that spirituality becomes something they choose, not something imposed.
I want to pause for a beat here. There's an image I keep returning to. A field of small creatures, ants, say, organized and busy. From a distance, it looks purposeful. Up close, you might see how each ant follows a path, sometimes without knowing why. The anthill kids, people in that community, were doing what they thought was purposeful. The question we are left with is, how do we, as a society, catch those where purpose is being twisted into harm?
We do the hard work of vigilance without paranoia. We educate professionals. We support survivors. And we create norms that make it easier to report and harder to hide harm. The world must learn to notice the small signs before they harden into tragedies.
So, what practical signals should a listener recognize if they suspect someone they love is slipping into a high-control group? Quick, concrete items.
Sure. 1. Sudden, intense distance from long-term relationships, friends and family blocked or demonized. 2. A single leader who claims exclusive access to truth or God's will. 3. Unpredictable punishments framed as discipline or spiritual correction. 4. Financial control, members not allowed to manage money. 5. Restricted access to medical care or education. 6. Extreme secrecy, especially around relationships and children.
And what should someone do if they suspect this? Don't confront alone and publicly. Reach out to specialists, domestic abuse hotlines, cult awareness groups, confidential social services. Keep lines open. Offer practical help, money, transportation, a safe place to talk. And, crucially, don't shame. Shame pushes people deeper into secrecy.
Yes, and believe survivors. One of the most damaging things is to question or minimize what someone is saying. Offer non-judgmental listening and help them develop an exit plan if they want one. That can include documenting abuse, making copies of identification documents, and building a network that can be mobilized quickly.
Before we close, I want to come back to the human stories. There are survivors who've tried to rebuild. A woman who now leads workshops for other survivors on reclaiming bodily autonomy. A man who found sober friends and slowly relearned trust. Others still wrestle with the after-effects, fear in crowded places, nightmares, difficulty maintaining work. The arc is not uniform. The point is not to fix every life, but to witness the ongoing consequences and the stubbornness of survivorship.
And to remember that survival is not a tidy narrative. Many people live complicated lives. Some reconcile with their past with deep ambivalence. That's okay. Recovery doesn't require neatness.
We have to admit what we don't know. There are still unanswered questions. What exactly went on behind closed doors for years before detection? How many near misses were dismissed? What role cultural blindness played? Those gaps are not just historical. They are instructive. They tell us where we're vulnerable.
And those vulnerabilities are contemporary. New movements, charismatic leaders, and online communities can replicate these dynamics. The medium changes. The underlying psychology does not.
So what's the takeaway? I'll put it in 3 lines. First, charisma and compassion can be used as instruments of harm. Second, the best protections are community awareness and cross-disciplinary vigilance. Third, survivors deserve dignity, care, and a long, patient listening.
And I'll add, we must cultivate a culture that sees suffering without moralizing. That helps survivors safely come forward, and it helps institutions act sooner.
We began with that woman on the side of the road. Let's close with an update. She survived. She testified. She spent years rebuilding. She taught others how to bandage wounds and how to trust doctors. But some of the people she left behind, friends, lovers, children, carried scars she could not reach. She lives with a set of questions she will probably never fully resolve. Why had nobody noticed? Why had mercy been so easily corrupted into control? Why did faith, which had promised refuge, become the language of prison?
Those are hard questions. They sit with us. They should. We must hold them lightly enough to learn and firmly enough to change practice.
We'll leave you with that. This has been Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. My thanks to Dr. Laurent Bouchard for joining me. If this episode resonated and you think someone you know might be in a coercive situation, please consider reaching out to local resources or national hotlines. Healing is possible, and you can be part of the safety net. A brief note about next time. We'll examine another case where faith and harm intersect in unexpected ways, this time in a different continent, a different culture, and the same hard questions. For now, sit with the unease and remember the woman by the roadside who became the axis on which a very hidden tragedy turned toward daylight. This has been Still Unanswered.